Hi everybody, and today we'll show you the Caroline Pacheco Andrade, and she
Understand.
will present a new article by Jean-Marc Newman, a French professor, on the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights and the creation of a new equilibrium between species. Okay, and Carol, and first I would like to explain you that the correct name is the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Animal, similar to the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, the human rights, the rights, the French Declaration, la
Right. But
Déclaration
that's
universelle des droits des hommes, oui, et des citoyens.
that's the that's only the title of the text.
Okay, okay. Good luck. See you.
Thanks, Professor. Now we're gonna start to present this text that Professor has talked about by Jean-Marc Neumann. So it is now recognized, according to the text, is now recognized that non-human animals, at least those having a nervous system, have sentience and capacities that are analogous to those of humans, and in particular the capacity to experience pain. Added to this is mankind's growing awareness of the abuses inherent in the exploitation of animals. So Uh, Following this, accordingly, it now appears necessary to reconsider mankind's relationships with animals. So the texts talk about the necessity of changing animal status and the consideration of animal relations with human beings that are also animals. So this relationship must be built through the consideration of science, of the advances of science. This movement culminated on October 15, 1978, with the proclamation at the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization of a Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, inspired by the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And aimed at recognizing the fundamental rights of animals. So, about the sources of inspiration and intentions, from the idea of asserting animal rights to the appearance of the first declarations. So, it is now recognized so the author brings us some considerations about the scientific advances concerning two animals, their capacities. It is now recognized that non-human animals, at least those having a nervous system, have sentience and capacities that are analogous to those of humans, and in particular, the capacity to experience pain. Added to this is mankind's growing awareness of the abuses inherent in the exploitation of animals. So here we can think about our last classes where we saw the thoughts of, for example, Descartes about that animals did not feel pain, some considerations of philosophy, but nowadays we have uh, the discoveries of science, so the new discoveries of science. So we have the means of thinking differently. Accordingly, it now appears necessary to reconsider mankind's relationship with animals. So, with this new information, we can think of new forms of dealing with animals. This movement culminated on October 1978 with the proclamation at the United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization of the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, inspired by the Declaration of Human Rights, aimed at recognizing the fundamental rights of animals. This is very important because we are not only talking about animal rights in general, we're talking about fundamental rights of animals. So we start talking about utilitarianism that we have already studied here in class. According to Neumann, a true reflection on the animal rights of animals, or the rights of animals, began in the 18th century with the English philosopher and reformer Jeremy Bentham. So Bentham was the first thinker to envisage the recognition of animal rights and to distinguish animal from things. So that's a very important thing. Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being? At a time will come when humanity will spread its mantle over everything that breathes. That's a sentence of Bentham that is very advanced thinking, formal thinking. So he had these ideas that were very advanced despite his time. In his Animals' Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress, originally published in the 1892, Henry Stephen Salt posed the fundamental question: have the lower animals rights? His answer was daring for the period: undoubtedly, if men have. So this subject was advancing through time. A second author, little known outside France, made a decisive contribution to the concept of animal rights: André Géraud. His Déclaration des droits de l'animal was published in 1924. Géraud's Déclaration profoundly inspired the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights of 1978, referring to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789. Equal in joy and in suffering, all animate creatures are born and remain free and equal in rights. So it was based on this declaration from the French Revolution. For the first time, Géraud put forward the idea of creating an animal code founded on three guiding principles. First, animals must be happy. If an animal is not happy, it suffers. Second, the sufferings inflicted on animals must be strictly indispensable. Third, the pleasures allowed them are quite justified. This means that for Géraud, animals must not be deprived of pleasure. For the practical implementation of the Declaration, Géraud hoped that it would one day be placed on the agenda of the League of Nations in Geneva in order to give it a global resonance. So it was his ambition to make the Declaration accessible to the League of Nations. But it was not until 1926 that the first formal animal rights declaration appeared, written by Florence Baker and entitled International Animals Charter, followed in 1954 thanks to the Reverend W.J. Piggott by a revised version. So we're going to talk about the main subject of the text. From writing to proclamation, a new moral code based on the progress of science. The first declarations that we talked about and the charters were essentially founded on the moral aspect of the relationship between humans and other animals. So their statutes of basically on moral aspects. The Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, drawing on scientific progress, proposes a moral code based on respect for life, its universality. So, the Universal Declaration is basically thought through the view of scientific progress. Molecular genetics established that all animals, including humans, are made up of the same material and share a universal genetic code. The equilibrium of living systems is based entirely on the diversity of the constitutive elements, just as the genetic and behavioral diversity of the species. So, in order to make a declaration, all these aspects of scientific knowledge were taken into account. Neurophysiology and ethology have, for their part, made it possible to analyze animal behaviors and establish their common basis. About the initial text, it was written by George Rose. In 1972, Hus submitted the text to the Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, of whose secretariat he was then a member. So, after several modifications made by the Association Conseil National de la Protection Animale, the text, then entitled Les droits de l'animal, 12 principes à respecter, was adopted by said organization on September 25. In its preamble, the 1973 text states that the coexistence of species implies a recognition by the human species of the right of other animal species to live. The respect of humans for animals is inseparable from the respect of man for another man. So we see that even the first text, the initial text, is ambitious. The text then sets down 12 principles that humans must comply with. In particular, humans must respect animals as living and sentient beings. I missed the S right there. Place their intelligence at the service of other species and lead children to observe, understand, respect, and love animals. So we're still talking about the initial text. On Article 1 of the text, it states that all animals are born equal and they have the same rights to existence. This article sums up the entire philosophy of the Declaration, the fundamental right to equality of species with regard to life. This constituted a major innovation because this right had never before been affirmed in previous declarations and charters, so it was remarkable. The second major principle proclaimed in Article 2 is that all animals are entitled to respect. This respect is not defined in the text, so the definition of respect is not clear in the text. However, paragraph 2 of Article 2 specifies that exterminating and exploiting other animals violates that right. Notably, the same article states, and this constitutes major progress, that man as an animal species shall not arrogate to himself the right to exterminate or inhumanly exploit other animals. So the text puts a human as an animal. The right of all wild animals to live free in their natural environment, the right of animals in a domestic environment, so environments to live and grow to a rhythm natural that their species have, rights of all working animals, that is, all animals used by humans for work, to a reasonable limitation of the duration and intensity of that work, the right not to be submitted to bad treatment or cruel actions, and so on. Experimentation on animals to be incompatible with animal rights. So it's very important, this statement in the declaration. Here, The Declaration recognizes the parallel between animal rights and human rights, which again forcefully confirms the essential principle, namely equality of the right to existence. While the text of the 1978 Declaration reflects the architecture of the initial project adopted in 1973, so the following version, it departs from it in spirit. The purpose is not only to protect animals, but to set down fundamental rights. So that's very important to remark. On their behalf, first among which the right to equality. So, the proclamation at UNESCO, uh, the International League of Animals' Rights stated that the declaration, in a final stage, shall be submitted to a vote of the General Assembly of the United Nations in view of its adoption in its proclamation before the end of the century. So uh, it was ambitious in this means because they wanted this to happen. The proclamation took place at 10 a.m. in the plenary hall at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. The ceremony took place before a large audience of approximately 2,000 persons, which included the ambassadors of 14 countries, numerous personalities from the science, jurists, members of parliament, theologians, personalities from the arts and entertainment, as well as journalists, witnessed the proclamation, which ended with the submission of the declaration to the Director General of UNESCO. So the event was widely hailed by international press. The Times, for example, is a great magazine, very known magazine, headlined its edition, "All animals are equal. UNESCO has decided." The American Daily International Herald Tribune announced, "Animals win Declaration of World Rights." But it is important to remark that the declaration was not, it was just read at UNESCO. It was not an UNESCO declaration. It was not produced by UNESCO. The reworking of the text. So continue to rewrite the text, and so on. Hardly had the 1978 Declaration being proclaimed before voices were raised against the text. Some called it ambiguous or unclear, and others said that it was not daring enough. It was ambitious, but for some, it was not. In particular, vegetarians, mainly in North America, protested Article 9, which accepted the killing of animals bred for food. So some people wanted a more aggressive declaration. For vegetarians, there was a contradiction between Article 1, all animals are born with the same rights to existence, and Article 9, which allowed the animals bred and killed for food. So it is an important to remark. The International League of Animal Rights admitted the need to review the language of the article, so because of this contradiction and other things. The French League of Animal Rights spurred the development of a revised text written during the General Assembly of the International League of Animal Rights. So, after some reviews, the new text is shorter, 10 articles instead of 14, and reflects profound changes. In its preamble, after recalling that all living beings possess natural rights, the new text, while adhering to the national philosophy, that of equality of species with regard to life, now specifies that any animal with a nervous system has specific rights. So it is important now to see that based on science, they limited the scope of the declaration to this of nervous system. In determining the rights to which animals are entitled, their sentience must be taken into account, and that sentience has presumably only been established scientifically for animals with a nervous system. Other important rights also are proclaimed. For example, Article 2 proclaims the right to respect. Article 9 further proclaims the right to recognition of legal status. So this is very important because this is a major revolution from Article 14.2 of the initial text. It should be specified here that the point is not to confer on animals a legal status model on that of humans on the grounds that they share the same sentience. So it is the recognition of a specific legal status for animal, but for animals. It is not the same legal status of humans. So we can consider the peculiarities of the animals and the differences. So continue the reworking of the text. Killing animals for food is no longer mentioned, so it's implicitly now, so it can avoid more criticism about the declaration. The 1989 declaration does not condemn the use of animals for food, which seems to be implicitly allowed. That implication results from the combined application of Article 3, 2, which says if it is necessary to kill an animal, and Article 5, which recognizes all forms of breeding. The amendment text is more concise. It is more precise on certain points and ushers in some major innovations here. The specific rights for animals with a nervous system, condemnation of hunting and fishing practice as a pastime, and above all, the attribution of a legal personality to animals. So this is very important. Innovation. However, the amendment text remains ambiguous on certain points, such as the notion of respect and the killing of animals for food. The revised text was accompanied by two additional texts, the Spirit of the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights and the Biological Foundation of the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights. The new text was sent via letter to the Director General of UNESCO, Mr. Federico Mayor Zaragoza. It recalled that the original text was proclaimed at UNESCO on October 15, 1978, and that 10 years later a need was felt to make a few modifications to the initial language. There was no new ceremony at UNESCO, so that proclamation was very important, but now this new text, even though it is more concise, more precise, but here it was they didn't do a new proclamation. One may conclude that the International League of Animal Rights did not wish to cause confusion or to be in the position of having to explain the reasons that led to amend the text barely 10 years after its initial proclamation. The revised text was sent to the heads of states and the highest magistrates of the countries represented within the International League of Animal Rights. Declaration. So now we're talking about limited practical scope. The declaration in its forms through the years, it was very important to advance about this subject of animal rights, but it has a very limited practical scope. So a declaration has no legal force. At most, it has moral authority with the weight dependent upon the institution that proclaimed and adopted it. It was the wish of the authors of the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, La Déclaration, that, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, it be later translated into constraining legal instruments. So the Declaration of Human Rights was very important to following other legal forms of protection of animals that were cogent. But now about Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, it was not achieved. About legal instruments, the positivation of legal instruments, it did not happen. It must be acknowledged that the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights has remained little known, in particular in English-speaking countries, and that is its obscurity has greatly limited its propagation. So it was started, advanced in French and about French people, French uh, intellectuals. So it did not. We know that English is mostly used to expand the knowledge through the world, but that the language was a limitation to the scope of the declaration. Several explanations can be advanced about this. First, only a single group, the International League of Animal Rights and its national leagues, initiated and defended the project. Second, the project resulted in fierce opposition from traditional users of animals because the very notion of rights for animals endanger their interests. Third, the project and its backer lacked the significant financial and logistical resources necessary for a project of such scope. For example, the dissemination campaigns, lobbying, and organizing events. So it's very difficult. Fourth, the fact that the project was francophone, being backed mostly by French intellectuals and scientists working in the French language. So it's contributing to the project was highly original, going too far for some and not far enough for others. So some difficulties like this. Most importantly, however, the declaration was doomed to obscurity because it was not adopted by any international institution. So unfortunately, uh, it was not adopted by any international institution here. As discussed previously, the declaration was proclaimed at UNESCO, but it was at UNESCO, but not by UNESCO. So it is important to remark this. Conclusion. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights constitutes an important milestone on the long road that will lead humans to redefinition of their relationship with other animals and of animals' legal status. It's very important. It has a limited scope. For example, in the text, Neumann talks about authors like Peter Singer don't use the text as a reference, but it is important, but the scope remains very limited. The declaration was the first to propose a new moral code for humans, so it is very important about this. It's a reference for other declarations. That is difficult to say, all the more because it is now subject to competition from other projects. Now there are other projects of declarations, including the Universal Declaration of Animal Welfare by the World Society of Protection of Animals, the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights by Uncaged, and the Great Ape Project of Peter Singer and Paolo Cavalieri. So nowadays we have other texts about this issue. The Universal Declaration of Animal Rights will always, according to Neumann, however, have the distinction of having been the first to lay the foundations of a new equilibrium in the human-animal relationship, and to proclaim the equality of species with regard to life. So the declaration is very important for being the first one to state this animal rights statute and thinking about a legal statute for animals. So it is very important here that we are studying it. It's still a reference, even though it was not too expanded through the world, but it's very important to reference. So that's it. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Congratulations, Caroline, Alexander. Thank you so much. Let's start the debate, okay? I will end the broadcast.